Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Publishers Panel of the 2020 BCLT Summer School, where we will discuss finding books, commissioning and editing translations, publishing them, readers' reports, samples, networks, book reviews, and that's just to get us up and running. And of course, we must consider the impact of COVID-19, not just now, but what its longer-term impact might be. In short, there's plenty to talk about. But first, some introductions. My name is Bill Swainson, and I'm a freelance editor and literary consultant who's worked with translated literature and non-fiction in both independent and mainstream publishing since the mid-70s. And I'm delighted that between them, our panel today covers such a wide range of experience, running from the commercial in Katharina Bielenberg, associate publisher at independent-minded MacLehose Press, an imprint of the mighty Hachette UK, and publishers of Stieg Larsson, David Leierkrantz, and Dov Alfon, and also of the non-fiction bestseller Norwegian Wood by Lars Mitting. Then we have the literary in fiction and non-fiction in Anne Meadows, editorial director at the medium-sized and greatly respected independent publisher Granta, whose books include Sayaka Murata's Convenience Store Woman and Turkish writer Ahmet Altan's prison memoir, I Will Never See the World Again, long listed while he was still in prison, but now happily released for the Baillie Gifford Prize in 2019. And finally, the defiantly innovative publisher from Latin America in Sam McDowell, director and founder and one half with his partner Carolina Orloff of the relatively new kid on the Edinburgh block, Charco Press. Charco got off to a flying start in 2017 with a Booker International longlisting for Die, My Love by Ariana Harvitz, and this year are on the shortlist with The Adventures of China Iron by Gabriela Cabezon Camara. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
I'd like to begin by asking each of you in turn to give a brief sketch of your work as a publisher of books in translation, and from where you find the books you take on, to editing, and hugely important, how you set about publishing them. And then we can move on to talk in more detail about the different stages, and especially the role of the translator in each of them. Katharina, would you like to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. So MacLehose Press, Bill very kindly pointed out that we're independently minded, and quite often in reviews in the press, people actually think we are an independent publisher, but we're hiding within a vast corporate publishing house called Hachette, which is a French-owned house, and actually has a really broad variety of other publishers within it, both literary and commercial, and obviously they have a huge kind of educational arm as well. So we have kind of editorial independence. We're able to buy what we would like to buy within reason. And our real challenge really is to try and sort of make our books, our 30 books that we publish every year, sort of bubble to the surface of what else is being published within Hachette. If you consider that would include, you know, John Grisham and J.K. Rowling and Stephen King, etc. It's quite a challenge. So I find that, you know, the most difficult parts of our role is really to sell to our colleagues, and I think all publishers would agree that even before the book is mentioned outside the publishing house, your key role from a long time out is to really sell to your colleagues. And the whole process really takes about 2 years, from finding a book to having it translated to it beginning to be sold into to other customers in bookshops, and then to publication. So with translations, it's obviously a much longer process to kind of sustain and build, with all that kind of UK-based competition in writers who may be much more sort of visible on the scene. And obviously, I think probably Sam and Anne would agree that book fairs are very important, but also actually building a network of agents and like-minded editors abroad that you can sort of exchange ideas with would be where we would hear about our books first. And some of us have been lucky to be invited onto publishing fellowships, which are funded by, you know, the Finnish Literature Institute on the one hand, or a Catalan Literature Institute on the other, So it's, being an editor of translations is lovely because you actually do get invited to really lovely places around the world and have a bit of an explore, as well as meeting publishers who are also invited from a variety of different countries. So you always feel like you're in very much a kind of international arena, which is great fun.
Thank you. Anne, would you like to go next?
Yes, of course. I'm really glad to be here virtually. So Granta is about 25 people, so we're a small independent publishing company. Small, not compared to Charco, but compared to some of the other indies in the Independent Alliance. And we were founded in the 1980s, but the Granta magazine we came out of Granta magazine, which has been going since the 1920s and was a periodical set up by students in Cambridge and published Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath, and has been very, very influential on the British and American literary scenes. And we sort of take the Granta magazine ethos, so we only publish what we call literary fiction. On the fiction side, we don't really do anything commercial. We don't have crime and thrillers. We don't have cookbooks. We don't have what used to be called chick lit, unfortunately. Unfortunately called chick lit, not unfortunate that we don't publish it. And on the non-fiction side, it tends to be narrative non-fiction. So we're the first publishers of Robert Macfarlane, the nature writer, Barbara Demick and Barbara Ehrenreich. So we have this kind of political spread as well to our work. So it's all, like MacLehose and like Charco, it's all sort of high quality books. Within Granta, I'm the editorial director, so I'm responsible for acquiring about 10 books a year. And as Katharina said, with translation, it's a mix of recommendations from other publishers, going on trips, direct contact with translators, which I know we'll talk about later, and just kind of word of mouth and buzz. I keep an eye on the prizes and who's winning them. The European Union Prize for Literature is very useful in that respect. And in terms of getting our books out there, I think the challenge of a small publisher is that we don't necessarily have the sort of the sales clout of Hachette. We don't have the sales clout of Hachette, so we have to build things from the ground and very organically, and often it involves going direct to booksellers and getting them to champion our books and sort of building and building and building. And I think with translation particularly, I think some of the anxiety around translation has worn off in the book world. Like, I think when I first started in 2010, translation was seen as this sort of separate, slightly ghettoized thing. And now, partly actually because of books that MacLehose have published and also Ferrante, there's been this explosion of interest from booksellers as well. So it doesn't feel like as much of an uphill struggle as it once did, but there are still people and friends of mine who've told me that they will not read things that have been translated. So we're sort of always battling that as well, that kind of stigma, I suppose.
Thank you. Now, Sam.
Well, thanks everyone, and thanks Bill for inviting us to be part of this. And thanks for the very kind words about Charco. So Charco Press started in publishing in 2017, and we focus solely on works by Latin American authors, by contemporary Latin American authors. And when we started out, the idea was to really bring some unknown voices through to readers of English for the first time. So a lot of what we have published, in fact, everything we published so far, we are the first to have brought those authors into the English language beforehand. So I think, as per both Katharina and Anne, the process is very similar for us finding new works. I think because we have a focus on one particular region, and because we have my partner Carolina, who is a translator, she's from Argentina, and she's also a specialist in Latin American literature. I think that really helps us sort of focus in on that region. And we have established some really good relationships with publishing houses, with authors, and with translators that we're also going to be talking about a bit more as we progress. And really, when we're looking for works, we're looking for a little bit about who's getting noticed in their part of the world, who's generating a bit of press, who's maybe winning prizes, what are other authors reading, and what are translators are reading as well. So, and all of these aspects come into a big melting pot, get all mixed together, and then out of that falls our publishing plans for the coming years. I think in terms of the stages, that how long it takes to produce a work, the costs that it takes to produce work, a translated work, that Katharina has already said, it's quite important to bear in mind that this is a very lengthy process. We're very new to it. We managed to get 5 books out in sort of a 12-month period, but we have spent the rest, when we first started, but we spent the rest of the time trying to stretch that out, or having to stretch that out more and more and more. And when you think about that investment in time and effort that goes in for creating a work over a 2-year period before it goes to market, and you start to actually see some income from that, I think that's a sort of an element that may be surprising to some of the audience out there, that it's a big undertaking for a publisher to take on a work and get it out to market, and they are taking quite a big risk when they're choosing to run with a particular title, both financially and also in terms of the effort that they're putting into that title can't be put into another title. So it's a big risk, and it's part of the fun and part of the challenge. But it's something that's obviously we're all trying to get right at every stage.
Fantastic. Well, that gives us a very good overview. Now I'm going to drop a metaphor into the discussion, which is if you think of the author, the translator, the foreign publisher, the agent, the publisher in England commissioning the translation, the translator, the sales department, the publicists, the designers, the people in the media who are interested, literary editors, you think of them all as members of an orchestra with a score in front of them. Each has a score of their own, which they have to get to grips with and get right. But the whole thing has to come together. Otherwise, your symphonic publication will sound like a toneless poem. It will go horribly wrong. So collaboration seems to me to be a key to this. So I'm going to move us on just a little bit to ask the question I think every emerging translator would want to know the answer to, which is, could you give an example, a detailed example of how you found a new author and what you had to do to get them up and running, get them launched into the world? Should we start with Katharina again?
So we're thinking of one of our, well, I'll talk about Norwegian Wood, which was a book that we literally bought in a pub, which sounds a bit weird, but we were having lunch with the people from NORLA, which is Norwegian Literature Abroad, who are one of the they're the Norwegian national fund-giving body for literature, and we were having a kind of lunch with them in the pub at Islington, Christopher MacLehose and I, and they had this little leaflet of a book that they had called in English Norwegian Wood. The Norwegian title was Helvetia, and which means kind of solid wood. It's like he's a good egg, or she's a good egg. They'd say in Norway, they'd say that they're solid wood. That's the definition of a very good person. Oliver, who was running it, he said, well, this is really not for you at all, but you should know that your author Roy Jacobson's just written the introduction to this book. And Christopher and I looked at each other and thought, well, I mean, I know it's a bit odd, but it might, who knows, it might work. We came back to the publishing house and said we just bought a book about wood chopping, and everyone just said, you're completely nuts. Luckily, it took us about 2.5 years to publish it for all sorts of reasons. We sold it to Abrams in the States, who were a very good publishing partner. And in that time, there'd been a sort of weird sort of rekindling of interest. I didn't really mean to use that word, but anyway, it came up a lot in our marketing, in wood-burning stoves and in kind of the great outdoors again, and people making things with their hands. And by the time we published it, there seemed to be a real appetite for it. I managed to get the print run up from 2,000 to 3,000 copies, and we published it, and there was a piece in the Observer by Robert Crampton, who'd been sent by the Observer over to see Lars and to chop wood with him, kind of a macho piece, and that was picked up by Chris Evans on the radio, and he interviewed Lars down the line, and then it just exploded. And I think it just shows that you just need a stroke of luck and a bit of connection sometimes to make these books work. And I think about this book is that everyone really willed it to do well because it had this, lovely witty title, and here it is in its finished form. And it literally is just a manual of wood chopping. I mean, it's not, but it's very, very readable, and it was bringing something very different, sort of very heartfelt stories about how, older Norwegians had been chopping wood all their lives in a way to tell their family that they loved them. This is how they were going to express their love for their family, was to keep them warm, essentially. So there were all sorts of things which were kind of partly but not completely relatable for us. And in fact, it went on, I think, I do think it had quite a lot to do with the whole Hygge movement here, that, everyone got obsessed about the Hygge books, and there were, the following year, I think there were tens and dozens of them. So it was a question of having a stroke of luck at the beginning, and then we brought Lars over again, actually, just before Christmas, and he went on to, I don't know, 6 or 7 radio stations, like BBC London, BBC 4, BBC 3, he did all of that. Went around and did a lot of signings. So we kind of really worked him when things were beginning to already move. That was the point at which we then invested in the book. So I think sometimes you can put a lot of, I'm not talking about money really, I'm talking about effort and energy into a book up front. But in a way, you almost have to wait until something good happens to it. And then you can use that thing that is good to kind of hopefully go for a snowball effect. I mean, I would say this is probably a once in a lifetime publishing success. It doesn't happen very often, but it was a real joy to experience it at least once. And since then, he's also actually nominally he's a writer of more of fiction, sort of mid, not, I wouldn't say commercial necessarily, but very narrative driven fiction. And since the publication of Norwegian Wood, he's actually had success with another novel called The 16 Trees of the Somme, which was picked up by Waterstones as their book of the month, which was, of course, it's one of those sort of very few things that can make a massive difference to sales, which, we all hope for. So now he feels like he's very established, but I have to say that he has always been brilliant at putting in the time, as have his translators. So, but it's been lovely to see happen.
Very good. Anne, would you like to give us an example of a Granta book and how you found it and how it worked?
Yeah, of course. I love the Norwegian Wood story. It's really inspiring, and it's been really interesting, actually, that I think it's one of those books that has spawned sort of copycat books, copycat publishing. But it's lovely hearing it go from 3,000 copies to being such a big success. I have a story which is sort of similar and different in that it starts with me messing up slightly. So I've been following this writer, Saka Murata, for a while. She was in the Granta Japan issue back in, I want to say 2015, with a short story that I absolutely loved. And I got in touch with various people in the sort of Japanese literary community to try and figure out who her agent was, which was not easy. And eventually I found him, and he said, yes, she's got a novel coming. And I started talking to a couple of American editors who are friends, and we were thinking about ways in which we could bring her into English and whether it was worth doing a collection of her short fiction, which is what she's known for in Japan. And then this novel arrived in Japanese, and I sent it to a reader, because we have a sort of series of trusted Japanese readers who we work with very closely. And she sent me back her report, and she said that she felt it was too commercial for Granta. And it was a really tricky moment. She compared it to The Vegetarian, which we just had massive success with, and said, I don't think it's on that level, and I'm not sure you should do it. And I talked with my colleagues, and we thought this is just too much of a risk. And like Sam said, there's so much risk in publishing anyway, that when you're looking at a book, and when you're looking at a book in translation that you can't read, and in this case where there was only quite a small sample, it can be very hard to take the leap, and it can be very hard to convince a team of people to take the leap. So we passed on the book, and then an American publisher snapped it up. And about 9-10 months later, I received the full translation from the American publishing house, and they asked if we wanted to acquire it. And it was brilliant. And it was nothing like The Vegetarian at all, and it wasn't trying to be. It was entirely its own beast. And I thought, oh God, I've made a terrible mistake. And then we were in this very small auction. But the good thing about it was we knew exactly what we had from the very beginning. So quite often with the work in translation, you feel like you've rolled the dice, or I feel like I've rolled the dice and I'm not sure what's coming back. With Convenience Store Women, it was very clear. And we'd had phenomenal success with another Japanese author, Hiromi Kawakami, who was shortlisted for the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize. And he was one of the first writers I brought to the list. And with that, we'd gone straight to Foyles, and Foyles had been really instrumental in selling. I think they sold sort of 900 copies of Strange Weather in Tokyo, like out of one store in 2 months when we first published it. So we knew that we had this kind of great asset and support with them. So after we'd acquired Convenience Store Women, we went to Foyles and we said, would you be interested in doing a window on publication? And they had this beautiful window with posters and shopping baskets and all these different things. And Waterstones have 2 stores just next to the Foyles Charing Cross. They have one in Trafalgar Square and one in Piccadilly. And Foyles started selling 400 copies a day of Convenience Store Women. And we got a call from Waterstones a day after the window went up saying, where's our window? We want one too. And it just sort of spiraled from there. And we've done, I think, I've not been keeping an eye on the numbers during lockdown, but we've done around 160,000 copies now, which is fantastic. And it's without any prize wins, solid bookseller support, but no big promotions. Once it started working, we started looking at the paperback, and we did these 3 different coloured covers, which we were very proud of.
You hold them up a bit more, Anne.
Yes.
That's better. Thank you.
There we go. And like Katharina said, our upfront investment, it was always going to be a relatively key title for us. We were hoping to sell sort of 15,000 of the trade paperback, which would have been great. And so we put money behind it and we put support behind it, but it wasn't until it became a sort of mini translation phenomenon that we decided to do tube ads and POS backs and multicolored covers. But it began with a kind of error, which I always find really interesting. My biggest success began with this error. But we're enormously proud of what we achieved. And as Katharina says, I don't know if it's repeatable, but it's been really delightful.
Thank you. Well, we wouldn't wish you many errors, but I hope if you do have them, they're as happy in their outcome. Sam, could you talk about one of your books?
Yeah, I want to sell 160,000 copies of something. That'd be great. The one thing that we talked about in the opening statement was around, this having to sell a new title or a prospective title internally to the rest of the company. And I guess that's one thing that one challenge or one advantage we have is that with just being 2 of us at Charco, we don't have to jump through that. We kind of just have to sell the idea to each other, or normally Katharina has to sell the idea to me. The example I wanted to use, I'm not going to choose one that started by mistake because that'd be hard to choose. I'm going to use one that involves the input of the translator in the process. So back in 2017, we were looking to do our first Brazilian book, or book by a Brazilian author, so a translation from Portuguese, because everything we'd done so far, or we had coming up, was going to be from the Spanish. So we were casting the net around looking for interesting works by Brazilian authors, and going through that process that I talked about before, just talking to people about what they're reading and what was going on. And one of the translators I've been working with, Danny Hahn, we can't really have a translation panel without mentioning his name somewhere in it. He had mentioned this author, Julian Fuchs, who had won a number of prizes for his works in Brazil. And he was very interested in what this particular author was doing. So we explored that a bit further. The name came up a couple of other times as well. We read through the original, but I didn't read through the original. Somebody that could, i.e. Katharina, read through the original. And then we went through the process of, we decided we wanted to have an attempt at it. So we managed to acquire the rights. Danny agreed to do the translation for it. And it really was one of those ones that sort of steamrolled a little bit in terms of the interest that it generated from relative obscurity from an relatively unknown publisher like ourselves, and the first time this author had appeared in English. I think there was a bit of timing there with Jair Bolsonaro about to be voted in Brazil as president, and what that sort of threw up in the international news scene, so that we very quickly, just as we were bringing that book out, there was interest from the media. So we ended up with a commission piece in The Guardian, written by Julian. We got him to do a trip to London. I should probably preempt that. With a very small publisher, there is little to no budget to actually fly people anywhere or put them up in hotels. I think even big publishers have this problem as well. But when all your authors are living in Latin America, about as far away as you can possibly get, it's very expensive to bring them anywhere. So we have to be somewhat creative when it comes to that. So Julian was about to receive the Anna Seghers Prize in Germany for this work, for Resistance. I haven't got a copy of the book, unfortunately. It's the one I don't have here. He was about to receive this prize in Germany. They were flying him over, so we thought, right, maybe we can actually pay to get him from Germany to London, but that much we can manage. So we managed to sneak him for a weekend. He was here for literally 2 days, and during that time he did an interview on BBC Radio 4. He did an essay he read for the BBC Cultural Frontline on BBC World Service. He did another radio interview. As I said, around about that same time, the piece came out in The Guardian. And it all just helped really feed into the prominence of his writing, and the novel that he had written. Again, the title is Resistance, and it's really talking about the act of resistance and all the sort of myriad of ways that can manifest itself. And it was very important in terms of what was happening in Brazil, in terms of the political situation globally, really, with Donald Trump coming into power, et cetera, and people feeling a little bit around, helpless, or what can they do, or what's happening with the world. That interest and success sort of carried on, and then last year we actually ended up winning the Best Foreign Edition at the Djibouti Prizes in Brazil for that title. The Djibouti Prizes are the biggest literary prizes in Brazil, so it sort of has come full circle to getting some recognition back in the country where this all started as well. And the good thing is when you start with that sort of a process and you've put all of that effort in, and there's been a lot of work that the authors can appreciate, is that they're willing to stick with you. So we have a new title by Julian coming out next year called Occupation, which we're greatly looking forward to. So I think each individual title we've done has its own story. Some have gone through a roller coaster ride. The process of actually starting with the idea, getting it through to appearing on bookshelves, and whether or not it's a success is such a mix of hard work, timing, a bit of luck, and perseverance.
Fantastic. Now, I want to talk about editing translations in a minute, but before we do that, and also the choice of translator, but since we've been talking about what allows books to be successful, what work has to be done to get them there, can we just skip ahead slightly and talk about what translators can do to help in the publication of the book, beyond, of course, providing the English texts that we all publish. Anne, would you like to go first on this one?
Sure, yeah. I think translators are amazing ambassadors for work. I think several of the translators I've worked with, Megan McDowell, who translates Mariana Enriquez and Alejandra Zambra for us, Ginny Tapley Takamori, who translates Sayaka Murata, they've really been very helpful in sort of spreading the word and getting in touch with reviewers they've met and things like that. They're also obviously like wonderful online groups of translators now on Twitter and on Instagram, and so I think translators can really amplify things. Ginny is unusual in that she's actually also come to Sayaka's events and spoken on stage about translating the work, which I think has been really valuable for people in the audience who are interested in translation in the process. But yeah, it's aside from sort of doing an incredible job bringing the text into English, I think there's a sort of promotional role as well, which some translators play.
Sam, would you like to take up on this?
Sure. The role of the translator is something that we have been very eager to provide more prominence to since the outset. So all of our books, we name the translator is named on the front cover of all of our books underneath the author. It's an extremely important role, we believe, and I'm sure the others agree as well. And it's an art form unto itself. Today, I think it's growing in its importance. I think the actual work of the translation is now really only part of the role or the function of the translator. We're seeing reducing column inches in the major broadsheets. They're doing fewer reviews. The reviews they're doing are smaller. Their reach is shrinking, and it's really a sort of a changing world. I think we're seeing much more of a growth of individual communities through social media, through bookstores, independent bookstores having a resurgence, book clubs, reading groups, and these other little microcosms that are bubbling up, and they all can tend to focus on their own different area of interest. But I think what we're finding is to be very, very important is to try and be as much a part of the conversation and as much as part of that community as we possibly can. And that extends to the translators as well. So we do a lot of events with our translators. Again, often we just can't afford to bring the author over for a book launch from Argentina or from Colombia. So but a lot of our translators are based here in the UK. So many times we've done a book launch where we'll actually do an event at a bookstore where the translator will talk about the work and the process they went through. And they've been really, really well attended. I think there's been a sort of a catch-22 with translation works that Anne was talking about before, that she has friends that don't really read translated works. And I think there's been probably it can sort of make people's eyes glaze over a little bit when you sort of mention that a work is translated. But I think if we're trying to find a way of both pushing the work not as a translation but just as an excellent piece of writing on its own, but at the same time make it very abundantly clear that it is translated by putting the names on the covers. I think it's an interesting balance to get right. Yeah. But coming back to joining that community, the translators, when they are vocal on social media and when they're joining the conversation, you can really see the engagement with the end readers. When you're talking about reaching thousands of people much more readily than was ever possible before, people do start to follow translators. They follow translators the same as they become fans of translators, the same as they become fans of the author. So selling points now are, this is a new book by such and such an author. Well, that's great. Oh, and it's translated by Megan McDowell, for example. People's ears prick up and they say, oh, Megan McDowell. Okay, well, we put that in as a sales point because that's important, because you have followers of the translators. And I think that's worth bearing in mind. It's not a nameless, faceless, anonymous function that's being performed here. I think we need to recognize that it's an extremely important function that's being performed. It's a bridge between these languages, and by translating a work, that translator has become part of the story, and adds yet another layer of richness to it. And we need to, I think, seize on that and run with it rather than trying to shy away from it.
Great, thank you. Katharina, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, just well, I mean, it's been wonderful to have prizes that recognise both author and translator, and recognise that translation is very much a creative act alongside the original. And yeah, I agree that, you know, even though we're part of a big conglomerate, we don't have any budget to bring authors over really either. I mean, that is a real case of relying on foreign institutes and getting the funding together. So we're also in a position where, you know, you rely very much on translators to be the advocates and to step into the shoes of publishers. And also when the authors are no longer with us, we've had, actually neither of these translators are on social media, but both Len Ricks has been the most incredible advocate for Magda Sabo, and Celia Hawksworth for Dasha Dundich, who died only 2 years ago. Sabo obviously died 20 or so years ago. And they have been confident to, you know, to present those authors in events on their own. I think Len did a really nice event. Well, he's done a couple of events recently, one at Lutyens and Rubinstein, and, you know, sold and signed books as well. That's, I've noticed that Goldsborough Books, for example, who do special editions, really want to have the translator's signature alongside the authors. And it's a real sort of emblem of recognition, which we really, really welcome, because, you know, the translators are doing an awful lot of work on our behalf, actually, on social media and doing events. And I'm hoping, actually, that, you know, that our new relationship with Zoom will make a lot more of this possible. We had a book club the other day for Lars Mitting, and Deborah Dawkin, the translator of his latest novel, was absolutely as, you know, the audience that were there wanted to know just as much about how she had found the process of working on that book as Lars had in writing it in the first place. And that's, I think, the kind of relationship we want to see. We struggle a bit, as Sam says, you know, talking about the use of the word translation, it does sound a bit, you know, somebody once said it's a bit like muesli. It's quite hard work, but it's good for you in the end. You know, there have to be other ways of presenting international literature. And certainly when, you know, 4 years ago, the Brexit vote happened, we tried to use that as an opportunity to say, well, okay, if this country's going to mess up in the way that it has, at least we can read beyond, you know, we can open our sort of hearts and minds, and by reading as widely as possible, sort of internationally. And our MacLehose has, I don't think it's terribly original, because I think the Hay Festival did it as well, but our kind of, you know, shout line is read the world, which, as I said, not very original, but that's what we're aiming to do, is to sort of open doors and borders in a way through our reading. And, you know, translators are very much a part of that. And as I said, you know, to get recognition in prizes is, I think, a really powerful sort of statement about how they are, you know, they're no longer invisible. And I think social media has changed that very much, to have sort of activist translators, as it were, very welcomed by publishing houses, for sure.
Yeah, fantastic. Can we now just focus a bit on the choice of translator, because I think this is something that's going to be of interest to people that are on the summer school course, but also to emerging translators who perhaps went through that course a year or two ago. So how do you choose the translator for a book, and what's involved in editing the translation once you've chosen it? And Sam, could you lead off on this one?
Sure. I need to start by saying I'm not a translator, and I myself don't get involved with the editing process, but I know I'm very close to how it works. I'm too aware of how it works. So in terms of choosing a translator to begin with, it's a little bit like choosing a work. It's a bit of a melting pot. First of all, if a translator has an affinity for a work, if that is a work or an author that they are already aware of, or better still, a fan of, that's a really good starting point, because obviously it's talking about doing a translation of something that they're interested in, that they feel an affinity with straight away. So that's a big tick in the box. The next part is really around, do they have any, have they lived in that particular country or region where where the author's coming from? Although a lot of our books are translated from Spanish, there's a huge degree of variation in slang and even the meaning of a single word or a single verb from country A through to country B can be completely different. So time spent, I think, in that part of the world where the author is from or where the book is set, I think is very important. And then of course it's down to also the quality of previous work. If it's a translator we haven't worked with before, we will get a sample done, and there will be a bit of discussion backwards and forwards around all of these aspects before a decision is made. And we also do look at, for those that have done translation before, previous works they've done and previous authors they've done, and factor that into it. And we also speak to other translators that work with us who make recommendations around that. One of the aspects I should probably point out, one of the goals with Charco was to try and bring new and upcoming translators to the forefront a bit more. So we have had 2 works by 2 translators shortlisted for the TA First Translation Prize for the first full-length translation, and that was Fionn Petch for Fireflies by Louis Sagasti, and Ellen Jones for Trout Belly Up by Rodrigo Fuentes. What we're trying to do is expand the group of translators we work with, the pool of translators we work with, and try to bring some new talent to the fore as we go. A mixture of working with experienced translators like Danny Ahn, Megan McDowell, and new translators as well. So that's roughly the way the process works for us at Charco. In terms of editing, sorry, I should say the editing process that we follow is quite detailed because Carolina is a native Spanish speaker. She gets very involved with every single work that we produce. And again, because given our size, we're only talking about 5 or 6 titles a year. So it's a much smaller volume than both Anne and Katharina are producing. So Carolina gets very involved. We have the translator, we have a copy editor who is normally a translator as well. And then we have Carolina, and they all take multiple passes at each translation to really get to the best quality possible outcome we can get to. And also we find with, depending on the author, a lot of our authors really want to be are very enthusiastic about the process and want to be involved. Some less so, others too much. But it's quite interesting when the authors really want to get involved, how it then makes them go back and look at their own work in a new light, question some of their choices and what they were trying to say as well. It comes back out. So you almost end up with this further distilled or further refined work at the end of the process when that comes into play.
Interesting. The original work can change in the process of translation with the author's involvement. Anne, tell us about Granta and commissioning translations and then editing.
Yeah, so I think quite similar to Sam, we have multiple routes for finding translators. So obviously sometimes it's the translator who brings you the book, which was the case with Deborah Smith and The Vegetarian. And so she's translated Han Kang for us ever since with great success. Other times, if I'm buying a book from an agent, I will quite often ask them for their recommendations. As Sam said, we're also always trying to find up-and-coming translators who maybe have worked on short stories or have appeared in Words Without Borders, for example, which is a great resource, but haven't yet done their first full-length book. And then we will invite usually 2 or 3 translators to ask them if they're interested, and if they are, ask them to submit a sample, which we pay for. And then we audition them blind. So the samples come in to our assistant editor, and she anonymizes all of them, and we have a little reading group where we compare them. And it's a really interesting process because quite often tonally the translations will be very different. And I mean, granted, we work across a range of languages, not all European, and I don't speak or read any of them. So you're kind of going by cadence and sensitivity, and if you have two very good translations that read very differently, that can be a challenge, trying to figure out exactly which one is probably closest to the original and to what the author was trying to achieve. And then we run the choice by the author, an agent. And they've never said no so far. They've always been happy with it. So that's nice. In terms of the editing, I edit a couple of translations a year, and then my English language books. And I usually, with translations, it's a very intensive line edit, irrespective of who the translator is. We take it very, very, very seriously, that the fluidity needs to be there. So it will be, a long intensive edit of thinking through every line, asking a lot of questions, some of which seem ridiculous. Sometimes I think in translation, little things go wrong, like the blocking in a scene won't quite work anymore because the translator has been thinking so hard about the language that they will have, forgotten to mention a roundabout or something. I had one instance where I was working with a very, very good translator, and there was something about a page that just didn't quite make sense. And I wrote to them and said, something feels wrong here, but I can't quite put my finger on it. And they wrote back and said, oh, I left a paragraph out, which was terrifying. So we take the editing very, very seriously. And then a number of our authors, particularly the European ones, are fluent in English. And as Sam says, will want to get involved. And that sometimes means further changes or pushes. But I think even more so actually than the English language works, the translations end up having a great deal of attention on the line. And the translator is involved the whole way through that. They'll be involved working with me on the edit, and then involved working with the author, and then the copy editor and the translator communicate. So it's quite an intensive process for them, I think, but it seems to work for us.
Thank you. Katharina.
Yeah, I always think that publishing translations is at least double the work of publishing English language originals, just because of layers of people involved. But so in terms of choosing our translators, I think we have a kind of conflict between using people whose work we really know and who we've worked with maybe for decades, and also recognizing that that we want to bring in sort of new translators or people who don't have a particularly long CV or maybe even any CV at all. And I do appreciate how difficult it is for emerging translators to get a foot in the door. I mean, one thing I would recommend always is, because a lot of agents now are using sample translations to sell the rights of a book, I think it's always worthwhile for new translators to try and get in touch with some of these foreign agents and offer their services to get some words on the page that then, when the book is eventually sold to a foreign publisher, and translating a book into English enables the Korean potential publisher or the Russian potential, it's a very broad base of people who will be reading that. But for an English language publisher to buy a book and then see who did the sample translation, that might then lead to a contract. In terms of the editing of books, yes, I mean, I think we do have quite an intensive process, particularly for the more narrative books and the crime books, because we find that while they have been edited in their original form, there's often quite a lot of kind of tightening up and smoothing that can be done to in a way make it appeal to an English language audience. And I'm not just talking about whether you name the police ranks differently or whatever, but just keeping a book, particularly a crime book or a thriller, really tight does involve quite a lot of I think more intervention sometimes than, for example, working on a literary book, which has, you know, sort of risen, bubbled to the top in its own language. And as Anne said, we do keep an eye out to see which books are winning the prizes internationally. So Christopher MacLehose would, I mean, he most likes to get engaged with, you know, with working on the crime and thriller side of the list, actually. Whereas for the literary titles, yeah, we do edit them very closely, and we'll either do that as editors in-house, or we have a kind of small group of maybe 3 or 4 copy editors who often have, you know, the language from which the book is translated, so they can refer back. But, you know, you can't always know the language that you're working from in order to do a good editing job. And we do, I mean, I would say I've had experiences in the past where you've gone in quite heavy with an editing pen or on track changes, and translators have been slightly horrified, possibly in the early days of track changes on Word, where everything looked horrific because it was all bright red, and people who were just getting used to that found that kind of almost an affront. But I do then go back over everything I've done and question whether it was necessary, rather than just a kind of a taste thing. Because, you know, you have to respect that translators have made very particular choices, and they have spent more time with that book than anyone other than the author, even more than the foreign editor, and often are picking up inconsistencies in the original, which they will share with an author, even to improve the original, as Anne says. But I'm married to a translator, Jamie Bullock, and I have to say he does do pretty much all of our German translations, though not exclusively. I have conversations with a lot of translators from Germany who say, yeah, well, there's no point talking to you, is there? Because, you know, you pass on all your work. And I do enjoy working with him because I can be really, I can go full into a translation and he's not going to get offended or feel that his sort of his pride is, and we can also then sit and go through it, which isn't always possible to have those kind of, you know, long meetings where you can work through a text together. It's normally a more of an exchange of, you know, electronic attachments to email rather than, except for perhaps in the final stages when you're just working through the final bits. But yeah, I mean, I think every translator works quite differently, actually. But we do take care over the translations, and if necessary, we do go back and you know, to change things slightly within reason to make it a slightly different book. But yeah, I think yeah, I think that's what I have to say on that one.
Do you think there's a way in which, now that most translations are edited using Word and track changes and the comment boxes, that providing you give everybody acknowledges that everybody's timetable is working at a slightly different speed, so scheduling is important. But do you think actually it's easier to arrive at a good translation because you can have a more informed and detailed conversation?
I mean, I've done both. So I have edited translations and then sent a paper version to the translator. And now mostly I do track changes, or I'll do the edit on paper and then transfer into track changes, because as Katharina said, I think it's important to question some of the edits you're making. So it's laborious, but sometimes I essentially do the edit twice. No, I don't think it's improved it necessarily. I think I find track changes sort of necessary evil, but they're quite a blunt method of editing something, and really ideally you'd be sort of posing questions and trying to encourage the translator to find the flow. And I think with track changes it's all too easy to just kind of chop and change and not necessarily understand entirely what you're doing or why you're doing it. And as Katharina said, it would be better to have a conversation or something on paper, so that there's a kind of liminal space that gets occupied. But it works well enough. And I think the other thing, I'm very keen to always have the edit done with the translator before it goes to the author, which I know some translators like to work directly with the author. And I can see that track changes would allow you, if you wanted to have a sort of 3-way editing process, which might work for some people. I don't think it would work very well for me.
Okay, now the great god of time has caught up with us. So before we go, could you each do the shortest possible answer on the question, do we think we'll go back to working the way we did before? That is, going to the office and meeting with colleagues and going out to meetings? Or do we think that the post-COVID world of work is going to change so that we'll be working much more at home, much more independently than with our colleagues than we have before? Katharina, would you like to start?
Well, I know for a fact that, I mean, Hachette offices won't be open until beginning of September at the earliest. And even then, I think we are being sort of firmly encouraged to be as flexible as possible with working. We were talking about Charco being based in Edinburgh, and one of the initiatives that Hachette is going forward with at the moment, and this was happening actually, this has been under discussion for a couple of years, is to actually open regional offices. So there will be a Hachette office in Edinburgh, Bristol, Sheffield, Manchester. And, you know, this is to encourage, I think what COVID thing has enabled us all to realize is that we don't all have to be sitting at our desks with our colleagues. If we can get some kind of happy medium, I mean, I think in the future I'll probably be in the office for about half of the week. And any meetings that we have in the office would also be open to on Teams for people who are working at home to take part in them. And that is the aim, is that you can be either there or not there, but you can still be a part of it. And I think that's really fantastic. It's I think we've also realized that to meet with our, you know, sales colleagues, for example, in Ireland, it used to be just one key account manager flying over there, having a meeting, going to the pub, spending the night in the hotel, flying back. And of course, what we now see is that actually editors can have those conversations with salespeople over Teams. I mean, I don't, you know, none of us absolutely embrace and love it, but we do realize that it's actually a really, really useful tool for working with, you know, people internationally or just people who are not in the office with you at the same time. So I think it's all about finding the happy medium and not discounting those, you know, what everyone calls the sort of incidental, serendipitous conversations that you would have with colleagues in the office. One thing that I'm sort of struggling with on Teams or Zoom is like, how important is a conversation that you set up a meeting and bring people into that meeting rather than just seeing whether they're at their desk and whether they're sort of free and then going to have that chat with them and talking to that person at the same time. So it's those sorts of, it's the hierarchy of importance of conversation, which I'm sort of, you know, which I think will probably settle into place, but it takes some getting that right, I think, while we're all sitting at our desks at home.
Thank you. Anne, even more briefly.
Yeah, I think it's still all up in the air, isn't it? I agree with Katharina that it has highlighted how important those little moments can be in the sort of shared conversations, and particularly I think less around acquiring a book, which we're doing very well via Zoom, but more around figuring out what the campaign for a book is going to be, and getting that kind of energy is definitely harder when you're all dispersed. But it has also, there's a lot of sort of waste in publishing, I think. And when I think back to how long it was taking each of us to get into the office, and then all of the lunches and the sort of, yeah, I think there was a lot that was happening that really isn't necessary, it turns out. And that's quite exciting. So hopefully we'll be able to remodel publishing slightly as well.
Thank you. And Sam?
Yeah, I think it's been a catalyst event for something that was sort of happening casually and in parts behind the scenes anyway for a long time. I think it's just suddenly helped a lot of people realize actually people can work remotely. And I think it does inevitably bring about some changes that the others have spoken about. I think one positive from a publisher of translations, I think it helps level the playing field a little bit with doing things like events and book clubs. You don't have to be in the town or in the country or go to that bookshop to be a part of the book club. You have now seen this upsurge in international book clubs, and you're getting people dialing into those for a Zoom meeting from all over the world. a lot of the festivals are putting in place virtual programs, and it's far easier for a smaller publisher like ourselves, with our authors all based in South America, to suddenly be participating in these sorts of things alongside the authors that are living in the country where the festival's happening. So I think there's a couple of positives, but I think overall it's a big change. I think the change will stay, and part of that is because people have discovered new ways of working.
And I'm just seeing the first questions pop up. So we'll start with one that's come in already from Fiona Graham, which is all about how publishers find their books. And it's such a broad question that I think each of our panelists could take one part of it. Basically, the question is, how do we find the translators, and I suppose also match them to the books that we're translating? Do we look at online literary magazines like Words Without Borders and Asymptote? Do we look at specialist magazines like the Swedish Book Review or New Books in German? And I think that will be enough to get started. So, Katharina, would you like to talk about how you find the translators for the crime fiction that you publish on the MacLehose list?
Yes, so, well, we've worked with a number of translators for a while. I think occasionally we have actually used the translators that have done a sample, or the agents have commissioned a sample to complete the whole book. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly some of our translators who would probably not particularly like to do crime, but many of who would do both literary fiction and crime. So I'm trying to think of a new translator that we've used for crime recently, but I think because we've all been doing parts of series, our relationships have been quite ongoing. So yeah, that's George Goulding picked up the sort of mantle of translating the Millennium series, and that really came about purely by chance, but he's kind of embraced it and also went back to translate one of David Lagercrantz's earlier books. So again, it's kind of connections and people being in the right place at the right time. But certainly we have taken on translators who've done samples, as I've said, and I think a lot of particularly Scandinavian agents are much more likely now to have parts, or actually quite substantial parts, of their crime novels translated before they submit widely, because obviously once it's in English it can be read by lots of publishers around the world. Yeah.
And how does that work for you, Anne?
So I think, like Katharina, we will look at who's done the sample for the book, and we will always ask, if you've done the sample translation, we will always ask you to, if you'd like to revise it, to submit it. And then I tend to audition sort of 2 or 3 translators, usually 3 for each translated title. And then it depends on the language. I mean, there are languages where there are people I know and have worked with extensively, and it can be very tempting to go to those people again and again. I always try and audition someone whose work I don't know, or whose work I've read because it's been translated by another publisher, but whom Granta has not worked with before. Depending on the language, I go further afield or closer to home, I suppose. So I'm about to look for a Danish translator for a book, and we haven't, not for a long time anyway, had a book translated from Danish. So I will be looking at probably Words Without Borders and Asymptote, and then asking for recommendations from Danish agents I know. And then I think the difficulty is it would be nice to be able to have a really wide pool and be able to give lots and lots of people the opportunity, but we pay for the translated samples, which means that we have to limit it. So I will look up the work of the people before I approach them, and have a quick read and check that it's got the kind of fluency we'd be looking for before approaching anyone. So yeah, it's a lot of hunting around on the internet, I suppose, is the short answer, as well as sort of more established connections.
Right. And Sam, how does it work for you in a very different sort of field or in a different part of the market?
Sure. First of all, hello to everybody, and thanks for all tuning in. I think we have a one slight advantage that we have there is because we're only focusing on literature from Latin America, we really are focusing on either Spanish or Portuguese. And we that sort of narrows things down a little bit. We also have the expertise for the language in-house, and with Katharina, who's also a translator. How do we find our translators? It is a real mix of reputation, recommendations from within the translator community. It has happened once or twice where an author has really requested a specific translator do the translation. But really, it comes down to who the translator is, what work they've done previously, and how are they generally viewed amongst the translator community. We get a lot of feedback from within our own group of translators that have been doing work with us as well about who else is out there and what they've been doing. So I think it's just it's important for us to keep close to the translator community and sort of try and be a part of it as much as possible.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Bill. I just realised that I should have mentioned that one of the other ways that we find translators is that we ask people who've done reader reports for us. So if someone has done a reader report on a book and been incredibly enthusiastic about it, we'll quite often approach them and ask if they would like to do a sample translation, if they're a reader as well as a translator.
Katharina, a question from Rosalind Harvey specifically about MacLehose, that you put out a call on Twitter for some pictures. How did that go?
Well, we had it was actually the idea of Elise Williams, my colleague, and it was really something we're kind of looking at is the possibility of setting up a small part of the list, which is really publishing from smaller languages using new translators and publishing authors who have never before been published into English. So it was a bit of an experiment to see what would come up from the tweet, and I think Elise has repeated it. And we've had some really interesting stuff in actually, which we're rather slowly going through because it's been a very kind of fraught and busy period. But yes, I mean, in answer to Rosalind, yes, we would certainly take sort of applications on email as well. I think there is an email address on our website, but you can have mine or Elise's very, very happily. So it was a genuinely, well, first of all, it was to see what would happen, and some really interesting stuff came in, largely from translators who have done samples themselves already and sort of had nowhere to send them or didn't quite know where to send them. So as I say, we're reading through quite a lot of stuff now. I mean, it's quite a difficult process. The kind of, I don't know whether we talked about this in our panel, but the filtering of lots of samples and synopses, and sometimes no sample. So then you have to make the judgment whether you're going to pay a reader if it's a language you don't read yourself. So it does all take quite a long time, and certainly in our setup, we kind of need to get 2 or 3 opinion on a book that we can't read ourselves in order to make the decision to publish it. So everyone has to be very patient.
Very good. And Anne, question from Margaret Morrison. You mentioned in our discussion earlier about the sample from Convenience Store Woman being quite short. The question is there an ideal length of sample, an ideal size of sample that would make it, allow you to make a more confident decision?
I don't remember if the sample was short. The translator, Ginny, is on here somewhere. She might be able to tell you how long it was. Apologies if I said that. I don't think that was the issue. The issue we had with Convenience Store Woman was that when I sent it for a reader report, the reader came back and said that it wasn't for Granta, which has since proved not to be the case, but is a perfectly fair judgment to make. I think in terms of ideal length of sample, it depends who you're doing it for. So with agents, I think most agents who submit things to me in translation, we're looking at between 20 and 40 pages, which is a good chunk, and I personally think is usually enough to get a sense of whether or not you like the language of the book and whether or not you're interested in the writer. And then you can make a judgment about whether or not you want to send it out for report, as Katharina said. If you yourself are doing this in your own free time and you don't have anyone paying you for that time, I think you could make it shorter, 20 pages probably, and then say to a publisher, if you're interested, I would be available to do more. It's a bit of a tricky business getting, I think, from the stage of translating for love to translating for money, and I would certainly not advise anyone to translate a whole book on spec or half a book on spec, not least because publishers have very particular requirements of things they're looking for, or you might absolutely love this book, but then when you talk to them, you might find that actually it's too close in tone to another piece of nature writing, or that it's too specific to the country of origin, or that there are just so many factors to take in. So don't spend, weeks of your life on something, I would say, if you can avoid it. But if you have a novel that you feel passionately about and you do have the time, or if you can find a grant somewhere, lots of language institutions provide grants for translators to translate samples, then 20 pages should be fine for a first bash. Yeah.
And a pitch going with it is never going to do any harm.
No.
Sam, can I ask you, there have been quite a few questions about the role of funding bodies, whether it's Pen Translates in the UK, or, as is more often the case, the Ministry of Culture in Spain, or the Dutch Foundation, etc. In Charco, how influenced are you by the offer of funding to support a translation?
In terms of the decisions as to whether we produce a book or not very. That's not to say that those sorts of funding sources are not extremely important. They are. The funding available here in the UK, be it the Arts Council England, or up here in Scotland with Creative Scotland, the Pen Translates, those sources of fundings are just extremely important, especially for a new publishing company starting up. And then from the source language, so in our particular case, if we're talking about some of the Latin American countries that might have within their departments of culture, they might have funds available that they put towards the translation of a book. It's very, very useful. Any funding is useful, but not all the countries do it. Sometimes the amount of money at the end that comes through, it never covers the full translation. It's more of a contributory fund that goes into the pot. So it has to be a way up between the amount of time that it takes and how many hoops have to be jumped through in the red tape versus what you're likely to get out of it and how much of a contributing factor that's going to be. That doesn't have no bearing whatsoever on what we choose to publish, though. It's a bit of a bonus if there's a funding source available. And I can tell you some really hilarious stories about applying for funding from certain Latin American countries, but I can save that for another time. It's not always what it seems.
Okay, now here's an interesting question, because we've been, as the questioner Susie Pickford points out, she says a lot of the advice on getting your foot in the door seems to be tailored to the more literary end of the market, like publishing in magazines and so on. Any advice for those of us who are actually more interested in translating genre fiction? So I'm going to come back to you, Katharina, on that one.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Genre fiction, I suppose that doesn't include crime fiction, which is very widely translated. I imagine you're talking about sci-fi fantasy. And we have within Quercus, where MacLehose Press is a part of Quercus, there is a genre imprint, Joe Fletcher Books. I think they have published 1 or 2 books, but I don't know whether there's a kind of a slight snobbery amongst English language writers of genre fiction, where it feels like there's not enough room for for translated genre fiction. I may be wrong there. And it's not something we've explored terribly well or in any great detail. We have just published Jin Yong, who's a Chinese kind of, I suppose, fantasy, like medieval fantasy writer. And, you know, there it was a real case of publishing an author his name is Louis Cha, who every, you know, Chinese reader from a very early age has known in some kind of form. And he was always sort of great astonishment. He'd never been published in English before. So we took that opportunity, and it's worked out very well for us. I mean, I find that we lose out sometimes by the fact that a lot of our authors are not really on social media, whereas what really drives kind of chick lit and women's fiction sales is actually the author's really, really great involvement and you know, the kind of group of writers that are sort of mutually supportive. And I would say publishing translations, it's quite hard to achieve that kind of level of kind of communication on social media. So yeah, it's not something that we have explored because we don't publish very commercial fiction apart from crime, I suppose. But I think you're right in saying that it's less tried than literary. So I'm not quite sure. But of course it works in the other direction. I mean, English genre fiction is translated in all languages. It just seems to be a little bit impenetrable coming in the other direction for whatever reason. I'm not absolutely clear why.
Thank you. Now, there's a question here about COVID-19. In fact, there are several. And I'm going to sort of conflate them into one, which if you could each answer in turn, is, has the experience of the last 3 months or so changed the way that you now are going to go about publishing the books that you do take on, whether in translation or not? Just thinking, you know, the other day we lost the Guardian Review, which is a major blow to any literary publisher. The Telegraphs, only one of them has been reviewing for the last year or so at the weekend. There used to be 2, and so on. So those old, if you like, old style print media are declining. Has COVID-19 just accelerated a process that was already in progress? Sam, would you like to start?
You mean it's accelerating in terms of that decline of the print media?
And the need to find other ways to reach audiences.
Yeah, I think, so the first part of the question that you asked, has COVID-19 affected our plans or what we plan to do in the future with our publishing? No, it hasn't. It affected some timeframes this year with our publishing schedule, but it has not in any way altered where we see ourselves going in the future. It has just simply thrown up some new challenges, as it has for everybody, and potentially some new opportunities. The point about the decline of the print media, I think that has been happening for some time. I think this the move to social media, to bloggers, to influencers has been happening for a long time as well. I'd touch on the point that Katharina made about it's a bit more difficult with when you're doing translated works, having the author engage actively on social media. And certainly I think that's where there's a real opportunity there for the translators to step in and almost act as surrogates for the author in some ways, but also to promote the works, but also to promote themselves. So I think those sorts of opportunities are arising. In terms of the getting reviews, etc., I think not only has the opportunity to get reviews in the print media seems to be gradually diminishing and maybe has accelerated even more in the last couple of months. I think the value of the how much of a source they were or how much of a boost you would see from sales has also potentially been waning. I really do think that there's more about getting out amongst the reader community, having that direct contact through social media, and having these influencers in social media out in the reader sphere that are championing what you were doing. I think certainly for us and what a newish publisher and a small publisher like ourselves, I think we see that, and the opportunities that are there for coming back to the COVID-19 side of things. We touched on it briefly, I think, during the chat, but in some ways, there's some benefits there for things like international literary festivals that are taking place, where previously we would have struggled from a cost perspective to get ourselves or an author to fly to a foreign destination and do an international festival. With so many of them moving online, suddenly everybody's in the same boat. So it could be local authors, 2 kilometers down the road from the festival, and one of our authors halfway across the world. It's just as easy to get them involved. So I think that there's some opportunities there that we should be looking at.
That's great. And Anne, could you comment from Granta's point of view on the same point?
Yeah, I think it's still too early to tell really quite how much this will shift the landscape that we're looking at. I mean, if anyone is looking for reassurance, I have just signed up a book in translation. We're going to keep doing it. It's a strong part of what we do. But we are also looking, I mean, it sort of depends how long some of the effects of the pandemic last. I mean, I know that Cheltenham is doing great work trying to move its programme online this year, and a lot of literary festivals that we would have had international authors at this year are shifting or moving or trying to find new ways of coping with it. But I think perhaps it's a sort of size and scale thing, that we're big enough that I do think this will affect us, and it will affect which books we take on and how and what the sort of prospects for them are. So I think I'm a little more cautious than Sam. It's definitely going to become even more important to have a very clear route from acquiring to publishing something and figuring out where those sales are going to come from. Because a lot, particularly for translation and for literary translation, a lot of our support was coming from bookstores. And we have seen a massive decline in footfall in the past few months. So yeah, we will weather it, but there might be some cautious years ahead.
Right. Now, in the last few years, one of the striking things that's been happening, particularly with imprints like Tilted Access or with Granta, your publication of Hang Kang, books coming in from little known in the West, that is, little known languages, little spoken, little translated. And the question from Timea Ballo, I hope I pronounced that correctly, where or how do you recommend emerging translators pitching samples of books by emerging writers who write in little spoken languages? So many publishers only accept agented submissions. Katharina, can you, in 1 minute, we're running out of time.
Yes, I mean, it's very difficult. I think it's been quite difficult for us to find or get submissions from some of the African languages, or books from Francophone Africa, where there aren't really that many agents working. And the same, we've even asked our colleagues in India whether they could be a kind of conduit for some of literature from some of the Indian languages. And it's quite difficult because there really isn't an agent network. And I feel very conscious of the fact we're not really doing enough of that. But as I think I said earlier, that, we would very happily accept kind of contact on Twitter. And that's what we're sort of reading through some of those submissions at the moment. And it's been really exciting actually, because we all need to steer away a little bit. We do, particularly from, from the sort of West European languages, which represent most of what we do, and look a bit further afield.
Right. And Sam, how do you respond to that?
I guess again, our situation is slightly different, because we tend to do our selections for what we're publishing from the original. So we don't have that engagement process with so much in terms of samples and looking for new works in that way. And again, that's a benefit of focusing on just the 1 or 2 languages. I think in terms of pitching samples for books or for ideas, what we do take on board and look for is any sort of submission that as to what a translator has come across. We've had translators go to international book fairs and then write reports and come back with some suggestions, and I think there's those sorts of avenues. It's tricky though, because like everybody, the publishers are extremely busy as well to how many submissions can they get through, and everybody's trying to find that golden nugget. But I think persistence is key, and then finding the right partner for the right project. Hopefully will bubble up out of that.
Thank you. And Anne, one last brief comment.
Yeah, I would second that. I mean, I think, you know, most publishers that do translation will accept pitches directly from translators, and our email addresses are all online, and I get, I don't know, several pitches a month, I would say, from emerging translators. I would also back up what Sam said. I get, I think, this year I think it's going to be more, but last year I got 300 submissions, and I think this year it's looking more like 400, and I am one person and I have no one else to help me read most of the time, because we've suspended our trainee program for now. So if I don't get back to you, it's please try not to take it personally, and I'm very sorry in advance, but there's an infinite pile of reading. But I do read the emails and I read the pitches, so I'd say keep it very concise, like a paragraph about why this person is the greatest writer from the greatest language that you have ever encountered, and be sincere and compare them to people that will be helpful, and then attach your sample and exercise forgiveness towards me for failing to respond in a timely manner, because I really won't, but I will read your pitch. Yeah.
Thank you. Now we're almost out of time, but before we say goodbye, I just want to read you a message in from Charlie Coombe. Talking of promoting ourselves as literary translators, please all have a look and subscribe to Translators Aloud, a new YouTube channel I started this year with another literary translator, Tina Kova. Our aim being to share videos of literary translators reading from their work. We hope to improve translator visibility, promote literary translation, connect with readers, translators, agents, and publishers through literary readings. You can find that by Googling it, and the important words are Translators Aloud. It then only remains for me to say thank you to our panel, Katharina Bielenberg of MacLehose Press, and Meadows of Granta, and Sam McDowell from Charco Press. Thank you all very much, and thank you for listening, and goodbye for now.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks,
Bill.
Bye.
Thank you.